This week on the final reel, I'm going to pay tribute to one of my all-time favorite directors slash writers, and that's John Hughes, who passed away last week at 59 years old. John Hughes may not have been the best director, but he was certainly one that had a certain influence on popular culture that I don't think many other directors had at all. John Hughes, John Hughes's movies of the 80s depicted that time and the period of the phenomenon that was the decade of the 80s, through teens and adults. He created the whole Brat Pack movement and made stars of people like Molly Ringwald, Anthony Michael Hall, and Judd Nelson, Emilio Estevez, and even people like John Candy, and child stars later, well, John Candy, of course, being an adult, sorry, and later on, child stars like Macaulay Culkin. Now, John Hughes' body of work includes films like The Breakfast Club, 16 Candles, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and Pretty in Pink, all of which depicted teenagers in certain situations that were both funny and at times a little serious. The Breakfast Club was maybe the best element of that mix, where you had the dramatic stories and the dynamic of every different character who was the same. It's cliche now, but back then it was a little something different to touch on that with high schoolers. Pretty in Pink was the perfect kind of comedy where romantic, well, not really comedy, but a romance slash comedy slash drama with the type of characters that are very interesting to say the least. The movie's heart was within its characters, especially in John Cryer's performance as Ducky, in my opinion, and where people come from is a very interesting point in this movie. Now, by that I mean where they come from their home life and where they come from, mentally. A movie like 16 Candles is just such a fun kind of campy film, just how everything can possibly go wrong, but just that one thing goes right, then it just makes all the more worth it. In my opinion, Molly Ringwald was tremendous in that film. And again, Hughes was just great at creating the characters and letting them tell the story and letting them unfold it and telling us about their environment without driving it into our head with a nail. Now, one of Hughes' best works was Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, a movie that was not a teen film, but starred two comedic geniuses, Steve Martin and John Candy. Hughes was a writer of all of his films, pretty much, but there were scenes where he let the actors do what they could do. Hughes was smart enough to know when to pull back and let the performers do the work. Who can forget that infamous scene in the hotel room where John Candy, after being ridiculed by Steve Martin, pours out his heart? That scene, from what I heard, was entirely improvised. Hughes let the two just go with it. But it was Hughes' direction, the zooming in on Candy's face, the look on Martin's face when he realizes what he's just done. It's just such excellent filmmaking that I think so many people can just learn from the things that Hughes brought to us. The way he cared about his characters. He cared about his characters more than any director, in my opinion, at that time, at least at that time period. Of course, one of John Hughes' last big efforts was a film called Home Alone. Of course, that made it star of Macaulay Culkin and created somewhat of a pop culture phenomenon as well that still lives on to this day. Again, it was another film where Hughes drew a character and made him the heart of the movie and let him tell the story. Hughes' movies were mostly comedies, but with lots of subtle, light, dramatic moments. Some of which were a little cheesy, but in my opinion, when they were cheesy, it was the right kind of cheesy. And when they weren't, they were very, very effective either way. John Hughes hardly did any wrong with his films. And while he may be gone, his legacy still lives on. I suggest that you look him up on the Internet Movie Database, look at his films, see his body of work, and if you haven't seen some of them, rent them. Some are hit or miss, but most of which are hits, in my opinion. So thank you, John Hughes, for providing us with some great movies and telling us stories within the hearts of your characters. Well, that's it for this week's edition of Bill Chase in the Movies. But don't you fret. Yes, I'll be back next week with more films. I got 6 big films for you next week, including District 9, the new film from Lord of the Rings director Peter Jackson. I also have Band Slam, a new teen music movie with Vanessa Hudgens. Also, The Time Traveler's Wife, starring Rachel McAdams and Eric Bana. The new comedy The Good, starring Entourage star Jeremy Piven. A new animated film called Ponyo, and 50 Dead Men Walking, starring Ben Kingsley. That's next week, and until next week, you can join my Facebook group, which is still Bill Chase in the Movies up there. Give me feedback, we'll discuss movies, yada yada yada. And that's it for this week's edition of Bill Chase in the Movies. Until then, I am Bill Chase, and I will be at the movies. Goodbye, everybody.